They challenged Earth at the Galactic Council. Biggest mistake ever. The doors opened, and every eye in the chamber turned toward me. Not with curiosity, not with welcome, with the kind of look you give something small that has wandered into a room it does not belong in. I was 29 years old, standing at the entrance of the Galactic Council's main deliberation chamber, and every single species in that room had been traveling the stars before my ancestors had figured out how to build a wheel. I am Kale Morrow, Junior Diplomatic Liaison for Earth, assigned to the Council station 6 weeks ago, and already certain that whoever made that assignment had either a lot of confidence in me or absolutely none at all. The chamber was not what I had imagined. You think of a grand hall, you imagine something that looks like what humans build when they want to impress each other. Marble, glass, height, light. This was none of that. The deliberation chamber of the Galactic Council was a hollowed-out moon, its interior carved into thousands of curved tiers that swept upward like the inside of a seashell, each level packed with delegates from species I had spent 3 years studying and still barely understood. The lighting was not light in any human sense. It was more like the air itself had decided to be slightly luminous, casting everything in a soft, even glow that had no source and no shadow. 312 species. That was the official count. 312 civilizations that had found each other across the dark, negotiated their differences, established laws, and built this place as a monument to the idea that intelligent life could cooperate if it tried hard enough. Earth had been a provisional member for 40 years. 40 years sounds like a long time until you are standing in a room where the youngest other member joined 4 centuries ago. I found my seat in the human delegation section, a small cluster of chairs near the middle tier, notable mostly for how few of us there were. Director Una Serrano was already seated. She was in her late 50s, with short gray hair and a stillness about her that I had never seen in any other person. She did not look nervous. She never looked nervous. She looked like someone who had already read the ending of a book and was now watching everyone else catch up to it. She glanced at me when I sat down. "You are 4 minutes early," she said. "Good." I wanted to ask her what was happening, because I had received the emergency session notice only 2 hours ago with almost no detail. But before I could say anything, the chamber tone sounded, a low, resonant hum that vibrated in my chest more than my ears, and the session began. The Velthari Dominion delegate rose to speak. The Velthari are difficult to describe if you have never seen one. They are tall, around 2.5 meters, with narrow bodies covered in a rigid external structure that is not quite a shell and not quite armor but something in between. Their faces are symmetrical in a way that feels mathematical rather than natural, and their eyes are large, amber-colored, and completely expressionless. They had been a spacefaring civilization for roughly 40,000 years. They made sure everyone knew that. The delegate's name was Counselor Verk. He moved to the central speaking floor with the kind of unhurried confidence that comes from never having been told no in a setting that mattered. He placed a data rod on the floor, which projected a soft display into the air, and then he turned to address the chamber. "Distinguished delegates," he said, his translator rendering the words in a smooth, formal tone. "This session was requested by the Dominion on a matter of council integrity, a matter that many of you have noted privately but none have raised formally. The time has come to raise it." He paused. The chamber was completely silent. "We move to reclassify the human species of the 3rd planet of the Sol system from provisional member status to the designation of protected developing world, effective immediately." The words landed like a dropped stone into still water. I felt the ripple before I fully processed what had been said. Protected developing world. It was the polite phrase the Council used for civilizations that were deemed too young, too unstable, or too dangerous to participate in galactic governance. It meant Earth would lose its seat, lose its voice, lose the 40 years of slow, painful diplomatic work that had gotten us this far. We would essentially become a nature preserve, observed and occasionally assisted, but never again consulted. I turned to Director Serrano. Her expression had not changed by a single degree. "Did you know about this?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "I knew it was coming," she said. "I did not know which session." "What do we do?" She did not answer immediately. On the speaking floor, Counselor Verk was continuing. He had a presentation ready. He always had a presentation ready. It displayed comparative data on species longevity, average diplomatic stability, technological development rates. Every metric was precise, sourced, and carefully chosen to make humanity look like a rough sketch in a gallery of finished paintings. Our average lifespan, 80 years, compared against the Velthari average of 900. Our civilization age, measured in thousands of years, against civilizations measured in hundreds of thousands. Our history, which included several centuries of conflict, compared against species that had resolved their internal problems before written language had been invented on Earth. Every number was accurate. That was the most frustrating part. Around the chamber, I watched delegates from other species. Some were leaning forward, engaged. Some were exchanging quiet comments with their neighbors. A few were looking at the human section with expressions I could read well enough. Sympathy, maybe, but not the kind that comes with action attached. The Kwarathi delegation, one of Earth's closest diplomatic partners, was notably quiet. Their senior delegate, a tall, slow-moving creature that resembled a very dignified deep-sea organism compressed into an upright form, was not making eye contact with anyone in our section. I had heard that the Velthari had been meeting privately with other delegations for weeks. Trade negotiations, resource-sharing agreements, subtle favors extended and received. It had not occurred to me, until exactly that moment, that all of it might have been preparation for this. "Director," I said quietly, "they planned this." "Of course they did," she said. She still had not looked away from the speaking floor. Why do they want Earth gone?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said very softly so that only I could hear, "Because we scare them, Kale. We just do not know it yet." Counselor Verk concluded his opening statement and returned to his seat. The chamber tone sounded once, indicating the first session recess before formal responses were invited. In the next 72 galactic hours, Earth would be required to present its counterargument, or the motion would proceed to a vote with no human rebuttal on record. 72 hours to argue before 312 civilizations that humanity deserved to stay. As the chamber noise slowly rose back to its normal background hum of murmured consultations and quiet translation chatter, I looked around at all those ancient, patient species in their curved tiers. I thought about the 40 light-7 light-year journey to this station. I thought about the 40 years of provisional status, the debts, the compromises, the carefully worded agreements. And I thought about what Director Serrano had just said. "We scare them." I could not imagine what about us could possibly frighten any of this. But she had spoken without any irony at all, and she was the least ironic person I had ever met in my life. So I held on to that thought, turned it over, and waited for what came next. The first thing Director Serrano did during recess was nothing. She sat at the small prep table in the human delegation's private side chamber, a compact room off the main corridor that smelled faintly of recycled air and old datapad casings, and she folded her hands on the table, and she looked at the wall for a full 4 minutes without speaking. I sat across from her. Our two support staff, a young analyst named Owen Fitch and a veteran communications officer named Clara Doon, were already pulling up files on their pads. I watched the director and tried to figure out whether she was thinking or whether she was simply letting the rest of us get our panic out of our systems before she began. Owen broke first. He was 25, quick-minded, and genuinely talented, but he had the same quality that I suspected I also had, which was that he expressed stress by talking. We have the economic contribution reports, the co-authored research logs, the emergency response participation records from the last 18 council-sanctioned crises, and the ambassador's address from the 30th anniversary of Earth's provisional admission. I can pull the cultural preservation treaties, the medical research sharing agreements. Owen, Director Serrano said. He stopped. Put all of it on the table in front of me, she said, and then do not speak again until I ask you to. He did. She looked at the files without opening any of them. Then she looked at me. Tell me what you saw in that chamber, she said. The Velthari moved to reclassify Earth. The supporting data was precise and framed to. Not what I told you to tell me what you saw. I thought about it. The Quarathi did not look at us. The Senhari delegation in the upper west tier were making notes before Councillor Verk had even finished speaking, which means they were already prepared to respond to something. 3 of the smaller delegations in the north section were using their private channel indicators, which means they were communicating internally during the presentation. She nodded slowly, and the Velthari delegate himself, what did you see? He was confident, not nervous, not performing confidence for the room, actually confident. Why? Because he thought he had already won, I said. Yes, she said. So the question is not how to make the best argument. The question is how to win an argument that the other side believes is already over. She finally opened one of the files. Verk has been here for 60 years. He has watched 11 reclassification motions. He has seen them all succeed. Species that were reclassified rarely come back from it. The Council calls it a protection. In practice, it removes a civilization from the table permanently. She looked up at me. He is not doing this because he thinks we are dangerous in the conventional sense. He is doing this because we are unpredictable. And to a species that has spent 40,000 years building a perfectly ordered system, unpredictable is the most dangerous thing there is. Clara Dune, who had been quiet until now, said, Then we use that. We show the Council that unpredictable is not a flaw, it is a feature. Director Serrano looked at her with something that was not quite a smile, but was the structural ancestor of one. Now we are starting, she said. What came together over the next 18 hours was not a defense. That was the first thing Director Serrano made clear. We were not going to stand before the Council and ask for permission to remain. We were going to present a case, and the case was going to be built on a single, uncomfortable question that the Velthari had never expected anyone to ask them. I worked through the night with Owen and Clara, pulling records that no one had ever assembled in this particular order before. The Council's own crisis logs, going back 200 years. Human participation rates in emergency response operations. Human-authored research contributions to fields that other species had declared complete or unsolvable. And then, the harder thing that Clara found at 3 in the morning station time, buried in a Velthari scientific archive that was technically public but practically inaccessible, because it was indexed in a cataloging system that only made sense if you thought in 6-dimensional spatial metaphors. She pulled it up on the central display, and we all looked at it. Is that what I think it is? Owen asked. Yes, Clara said. They are going to deny it. They cannot, she said. It is their own archive. It was a stellar mass correction paper, published 81 years ago by a physicist from New Zealand named Gordon Price, in a small Earth academic journal that had a readership of maybe 400 people at the time. Gordon Price had been working on theoretical models of gravitational interference around high-density binary systems, a problem that was, from a human perspective, essentially a very abstract mathematical hobby. He had no idea that the Velthari home system was experiencing exactly the instability his model described. He had never heard of the Velthari. He was just a man who liked numbers and spent his evenings trying to make them work. The Velthari, on the other hand, had been watching their secondary star behave in ways their models could not explain for decades. They had commissioned 3 separate scientific panels. None of them had solved it. Then somehow, a copy of Gordon Price's paper had reached a Velthari researcher, and the correction had been applied, and the problem had been resolved, and the Velthari home system had not experienced the catastrophic gravitational event that their own models had deemed increasingly probable. They had never credited Gordon Price. They had never acknowledged the paper. As far as the public record of the Velthari Dominion was concerned, their own researchers had solved the problem independently. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling of the small prep room. Outside, the station continued its low, constant hum. Somewhere in the main chamber, Counselor Verk was probably sleeping with the complete peace of a being who had no idea what was being assembled in this room. "Director," I said, when she came back from a brief rest and saw what we had found, "how do we present this without it looking like an attack?" "It will look like an attack," she said calmly. "That is fine. An attack is not illegal in this chamber. Only a lie is." She sat down and looked at the paper on the display. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, almost to herself, "Gordon Price, did he know what he had done?" "He died 12 years after publishing the paper," Owen said. "A fishing accident in the South Island. There is no indication he ever knew the Velthari existed." Director Serrano was quiet again. Then she stood up and said, "Let us go make sure the galaxy knows he did." The formal hearing opened 14 hours later. The chamber was at full capacity. This was not routine, and everyone in it knew that. Reclassification hearings for member species were rare. Most species, when they reached this point, had already negotiated quietly and accepted the outcome before it became public. The fact that Earth had not done so had apparently generated significant interest. I took my seat in the observer gallery as the director had instructed. She wanted me watching the room, not the speaker's floor. Counselor Verk presented the Velthari's formal case first, as the initiating party. It was thorough, calm, and devastating in its logic. He addressed stability metrics, resource contributions, historical conflict patterns, and developmental trajectory. Every argument was framed in the language of concern, protection, and orderly progress. By the time he finished, I could see that at least 40 delegations were nodding in the particular way that beings nod when they have already decided, and are simply waiting for the formality to conclude. Then Director Serrano walked to the speaking floor. She stood there for a moment without saying anything, not for dramatic effect. I do not think she was capable of caring about dramatic effect. She was simply looking at the chamber the way a person looks at a map before a long journey, making sure she knew where everything was. Then she said, "I would like to begin with a question." She looked around the room. "Can anyone here tell me the precise definition of a civilized species?" The chamber stirred. It was not a question anyone had expected. "I ask," she continued, "because the Velthari Dominion has presented a framework that judges Earth by a specific set of criteria. I would like to understand where those criteria came from. Who decided that longevity is civilization? Who decided that internal conflict disqualifies a species from participating in galactic governance? Who wrote the standard, and did they write it before or after they knew what we were?" She let that land, then she opened the first file. What followed was the most remarkable 2 hours I had ever witnessed in any room on any world. She did not shout. She did not perform. She walked the council through a very simple, very precise argument, backed by the council's own records, its own crisis logs, its own scientific databases. She showed, without commentary or embellishment, every instance in the past 200 years where a human contribution, credited or uncredited, had changed an outcome that the established models of older civilizations had written off. She showed them Gordon Price's paper. She showed them the Velthari archive. She showed them the dates, the publication record, the timeline of the Velthari's internal crisis and its resolution. She did not accuse Counselor Verk of anything. She simply placed the information on the table and invited the chamber to draw its own conclusions. And then she asked the question that I think no delegate in that room had prepared for. How many other papers are there? How many other small, quiet human contributions have been absorbed into the record of older civilizations without a name attached? She paused. Then she said, very quietly, "We are not asking you to fear us. We are not asking you to admire us. We are asking you to be honest about what the record actually shows. Because the record shows that Earth, in 40 years, has contributed more to the unsolvable problems of this galaxy than most of you expected from us in 400. The chamber was absolutely still. I looked at Counselor Verk. His expression had not changed, but his hands had. They were pressed flat on the surface in front of him in a way that looked deliberate, like a being that had decided to be very careful about what its body communicated. He was not angry. Director Serrano had been right about that too. He was something else entirely. He was recalculating. Around the chamber, I watched things shift. The Kwarathi delegate, who had not looked at our section all morning, was now looking directly at Director Serrano. The Senhari delegates who had been taking notes before the session even started were now taking different notes, faster ones, their instruments moving with a kind of urgency they had not shown before. The director returned to her seat. She sat down next to me and picked up her water container and took a measured sip. She did not look at the room, or at the display, or at Counselor Verk. She looked at me. "What do you see?" she asked. I looked at the chamber. I looked at 312 civilizations in various states of reassessment. "I see people reading the ending of a book," I said. She did not smile, but something in her face settled. "Yes," she said, "now we wait for the vote." But I already knew, even then, watching the room, that the vote was no longer the most interesting thing happening. The most interesting thing was the question Director Serrano had put into the air, the one no one could quite shake. How many other Gordons were there? How many other problems had been quietly, unknowingly, accidentally solved by people who never knew they were solving anything at all? I thought about that, and for the first time since I had walked into this chamber, I did not feel small. I felt like the beginning of something. The vote came back in 7 hours. Earth's provisional status was upheld. The margin was larger than anyone had projected, including, I suspected, Director Serrano herself, though she gave no indication of this when Clara read out the numbers. 41 delegations that the Velthari had apparently counted on voted against the reclassification motion. Some of those delegations had taken meetings with Velthari representatives in the weeks prior. Some of them had accepted trade arrangements and research-sharing agreements that were widely understood to be quiet incentives for political alignment. And they had voted against the motion anyway. Counselor Verk stood when the result was announced. He turned his amber eyes toward our section for exactly 3 seconds. Then he walked out of the chamber without speaking to anyone. He did not look angry. I kept thinking about that. An angry being shows you something useful. It shows you the edge of what they can tolerate, the point at which their calculation broke down. Verk showed me nothing. He walked out with the same measured pace he had walked in with, and the absence of reaction was itself a kind of communication I did not know how to read yet. I leaned toward Director Serrano as the chamber began to break into clusters of quiet conversation. "He is not done," I said. "No," she agreed. "We made an enemy today." "We already had an enemy," she said. "Today we made an honest one. That is actually an improvement." The post-session corridor outside the chamber was the kind of controlled chaos that follows any major council decision. Delegates moved in careful, purposeful streams. Translation chatter layered over itself. Our small team was immediately approached by 3 separate delegations before we had gone 30 meters. The first was the Senhari, a species of mid-sized, pale-skinned beings with large, lidded eyes, and a reputation for methodical intelligence gathering. Their delegate, a composed individual named Suveth, offered what I understood to be a formal diplomatic acknowledgement of the outcome, and then, almost as an afterthought, mentioned that the Senhari Technical Institute would be interested in co-authoring a review paper on human adaptive problem-solving methodologies. It was phrased as an academic proposal. It was actually an intelligence-gathering request. They wanted to understand how we thought. Director Serrano thanked them warmly and said she would have Owen send through the relevant contact protocols. The second approach came from a species called the Dryathi, a small, aquatic atmospheric civilization that maintained their atmosphere in small personal bubbles of pressurized moisture. They were one of the more quietly powerful species in the Council, rarely vocal but consistently present in the key votes. Their delegate said very little but pressed a small data token into Director Serrano's hand and said, "For your junior liaison, the director knows why." She passed the token to me without looking at it. I put it in my jacket pocket and did not ask questions. The third approach was from the Qorathi. Their senior delegate moved slowly, as they always did, their long body finding its patient way through the corridor crowd. When they reached us, they stopped, and there was a pause of about 15 seconds that in Qorathi communication carried significant weight, the equivalent of a long, considered breath. "We did not speak on your behalf in the chamber," the delegate said at last. "We noticed," Director Serrano said pleasantly. Another pause. "The arrangement with the Velthari was made before your case was fully understood by this delegation. We regret the appearance of withdrawal." "It must have been a difficult position," she said. "We understand." And she did understand. That was the thing about her. She was not performing grace. She genuinely understood that the Qorathi had been maneuvered into a corner, had weighed their options, and had ultimately chosen not to act against us even if they had not acted for us. In the language of galactic politics, that was not nothing. "Your director's question," the Qorathi delegate said after a moment, "regarding the definition of a civilized species, it will be discussed." "Good," she said. "That was the intention." They moved on. I watched them go and then looked at Director Serrano. "The Qorathi just told us they are going to push for a formal review of the Council's classification criteria." "Eventually," she said. "It will take years, but yes." Owen fell into step beside me as we resumed walking. He was quieter than usual, which for Owen meant something was bothering him. After a moment he said, "The Senhari co-authorship proposal, that is not really about academic research." "No," I agreed. "And the Dryathi token, do you know what it is?" I pulled it out of my pocket and turned it over. It was a small thing, dark and smooth, with a microsurface that pulsed faintly with data light. "Not yet." "The director does," Clara said from my other side. "She said she knows why." I looked at the token. Something about its weight felt significant in a way I could not immediately explain. Back in the prep room, I finally had a moment to myself while the director was in a secure call with Earth's governmental contact. I sat at the table with the token in front of me and thought about the day. We had won. Unambiguously, measurably, publicly won. The motion had failed. Earth's seat was secure. Director Serrano had walked into a room where the outcome was considered settled and had unsettled it. I should have felt relief. I should have felt the clean, bright energy of a hard thing done well. Instead, I kept thinking about Counselor Verk's face as he walked out of the chamber. The absence of anger. The 3-second look at our section before he turned away. It was the look of someone who had just received useful information. We had shown our hand. We had shown them what we were capable of under pressure, what kind of arguments we could construct, what kind of records we could access, what kind of case we could build in 72 hours with 3 people and a small prep room. Verk had come in expecting a routine outcome. He had received, instead, a very detailed briefing on human capability. I picked up the Dryathi token and turned it over again. Director Serrano came back into the room 40 minutes later. She glanced at the token in my hand and said, You should open it. How? She crossed to me and pressed her thumb against one edge of the token. The surface shifted, unfolding in a way that was not mechanical but somehow organic, like a seed opening. Inside was a data structure, a small, compressed file that resolved into a document when I touched it. It was a transmission record, Velthari internal communication, encoded in a cipher that should have been unbreakable. It was addressed to a secondary Velthari diplomatic channel, sent 3 days before the council session. I read it, then I read it again. The expulsion vote, the entire motion, the weeks of lobbying, the presentations, the trade arrangements used as quiet bribes, all of it had been a test. Not an attempt to actually remove Earth from the council, though they would have accepted that outcome if it came. Primarily, it had been a structured observation. They had wanted to see how we responded under pressure, what resources we could mobilize, how quickly we could build a case, whether our leadership cracked or held. The document referred to us throughout not as a threat or as a nuisance, but as a variable. An unpredictable variable in a system the Velthari had spent 40,000 years making predictable. And variables, the document made clear, needed to be fully understood before they could be managed. We had just given them a very thorough look at us. They were measuring us, I said. Yes, said Director Serrano. The whole thing was a controlled experiment. Largely, yes. I set the token down on the table. Then we just gave them exactly what they wanted. We gave them some of what they wanted, she said. She sat down across from me. We also gave them something they did not expect. They expected us to be defensive or frightened, or to make the kind of argument that comes from a species trying to justify its existence. We did not do that. The question Una Serrano asked that chamber today, the question about the definition of civilization, that is not in any Velthari predictive model. I can promise you that. I looked at her. How do you know? Because if it were, they would have prepared a response to it, and they did not. She folded her hands on the table. They can measure what we did. They cannot yet measure how we thought of it. That gap is our most valuable asset right now, and we need to protect it. I thought about what she had said earlier in the chamber when the session had barely started and I had not yet understood what we were walking into. We scare them. We just do not know it yet. I thought I understood it a little better now. It was not our capability that frightened the Velthari. It was the fact that our capability could not be fully modeled. They could predict species whose patterns were thousands of years old. They could map the behavior of civilizations that had reached a kind of equilibrium, that had settled into known grooves of decision-making and response. We had no such grooves. We had 80-year lifespans and short institutional memories, and a habit of solving problems by trying approaches that no one with a longer memory would ever consider seriously. We were not powerful. We were genuinely surprising. And in a galaxy that had been mostly predictable for a very long time, genuinely surprising was a category that did not have a comfortable place in anyone's models. Owen knocked and opened the prep room door. Director, there is a communication from the Velthari delegation. Formal, diplomatic. They are requesting a private meeting. Director Serrano did not hesitate. Decline politely. Tell them we will be happy to meet in any open session context. She looked at me. We do not meet them privately until we understand the full shape of what they are planning. Private meetings are where accommodations are made. We are not ready to accommodate anyone yet. Owen nodded and disappeared. Clara appeared in the doorway a moment later. The Dryathai delegate also sent a message. It says simply, there will be a second test. The first was for data, the second will be for something else. The room was quiet. Did they say what the second test would be? I asked. No, Clara said. Director Serrano was already standing, already moving toward the door. Then we had better spend the next several weeks figuring that out before it arrives. She paused at the threshold and looked back at me. The most dangerous thing in any competition, Kale, is not the opponent who is trying to beat you. It is the opponent who is trying to understand you. Understanding leads to control. We cannot let ourselves be fully understood." She left. I sat alone in the prep room for a moment, the Dryathai token on the table in front of me, the weight of the day settling around me like something physical. We had won. Earth was still at the table. Director Serrano had done something extraordinary in that chamber, had turned a foregone conclusion into an open question, and an open question into a victory. But the Velthari had gotten what they came for, at least partially. And someone we barely knew had just warned us that there was another move coming. I picked up the token, put it in my pocket, and went to find Owen. We had a lot of work to do. 6 months passed. In those 6 months, Earth's position at the Council changed in ways that were difficult to describe and even harder to manage. Before the hearing, we were background noise, a provisional species that was present but not particularly significant. After it, we were something else. Not powerful, not feared exactly, but noticed. And being noticed in the Galactic Council has consequences that compound over time. We were invited to 3 emergency subcommittee sessions, 2 of which related to resource allocation disputes that had been simmering for decades, and one of which was a genuine crisis involving a rogue automated terraforming station that had begun processing an inhabited moon without authorization. We were asked twice to contribute to joint research initiatives. We received 17 formal diplomatic inquiries from species that had not previously communicated with Earth's delegation at all. Every single one of these opportunities was also a test of some kind. I had learned to see that now. The invitations were also observations. The inquiries were also assessments. Everyone wanted to know what we would do when we were given actual influence. I spent those 6 months reading every crisis log, every recorded negotiation, every documented decision that the Council had made over the past 3 centuries. Owen thought I was preparing for something specific. Clara suspected I was just anxious and filling the time. Director Serrano said nothing about it, which meant she approved. What I was doing, though I did not fully know it at the time, was learning the shape of how the Council thought. Not the rules, I already knew the rules, but the texture of decision-making in a room full of ancient civilizations. The patterns. The places where established process moved fast and the places where it moved slow. The questions that made delegates uncomfortable and the arguments that made them feel safe. The Velthari had retreated into formal correctness after the hearing. Councillor Verk had been replaced as lead delegate by a younger Velthari named Resvaro. Resvaro was quieter than Verk, more careful, and notably more interested in one-on-one conversations with delegates from smaller civilizations. He was building something. I was certain of it. I just could not see the full shape yet. The crisis that broke the 6-month pause arrived on a Tuesday, which is a human measurement of time that has no meaning to anyone else in the galaxy, but which I note anyway because it is the kind of small, human detail that I have learned to hold onto. A rogue terraforming event had gone critical in the Shaylin Corridor, a shared trade route running through the space managed by 4 mid-tier Council species. The automated systems involved had been commissioned 90 years ago and had operated without incident until a gravitational shift caused by the slow passage of a rogue stellar body began interfering with the correction algorithms. The systems, rather than shutting down, had begun improvising. And what they were improvising, at an accelerating pace, was the atmospheric conversion of 3 planets in the corridor, one of which was a transit hub used by 17 species. The Emergency Response Subcouncil convened immediately. I was in the room because Earth had been added to the subcouncil roster 4 months earlier, a quiet administrative change that I had noted and Director Serrano had called routine. I was not senior enough to be there as a primary decision-maker. I was there to observe and relay. The subcouncil had 15 members. 12 of them were from civilizations with direct interests in the Shaylin Corridor. The other 3 were observer advisors. The session lasted 4 hours before it reached complete gridlock. The problem was not technical. The problem was procedural. The automated systems were licensed under a joint agreement between the four managing species, and any significant intervention required approval from all four. Two of those species were currently in a separate diplomatic dispute over water rights on a completely different system, and they were refusing to authorize any joint action until that dispute was resolved. The other two were willing to act, but technically could not do so unilaterally under the terms of the licensing agreement. Meanwhile, the terraforming systems continued their improvised work. The atmospheric conversion rate was accelerating. Models showed that the transit hub planet would be significantly affected within 14 days. Evacuation was possible but would take 11 days to complete, and required the cooperation of shipping resources from 3 other species, at least 2 of which were waiting to see how the authorization dispute was resolved before committing assets. The session models, run 3 times with different variable inputs by 2 separate technical teams, all returned the same projection. If nothing changed in the authorization structure within the next 96 hours, the cascading delays would make a complete evacuation impossible. A Senhari technical advisor presented this projection calmly. The chamber acknowledged it, and then returned to arguing about the authorization structure. I sat in my observer seat and listened to brilliant, experienced delegates from ancient civilizations go around the same loop for the 4th time. They were not being stupid. Every objection raised was legally sound. Every argument for delay had genuine diplomatic weight behind it. The Council's processes had been built over centuries to handle exactly this kind of dispute, and those processes were now being applied with rigorous precision to a situation that would be over before the processes finished running. I thought about what Director Serrano had said to me on the night after the hearing, about the danger of being useful, about how showing the galaxy that you could solve impossible problems put you in the room for every impossible problem after that. I thought about the 6 months of reading, the shape of how this room moved, the places where it could be interrupted. I also thought about what Clara had relayed to me months ago. There will be a second test. The first was for data, the second will be for something else. Standing up in this session, unscheduled, without the director present, without authorization, would be a protocol violation. It would embarrass the delegation. It would make me visible in a way that visibility-averse diplomatic practice strongly discouraged. It would also almost certainly not work, because even if I said something useful, the authorization dispute was a structural problem that no argument could resolve in the next 4 hours. I ran through it in my head. I ran through it again. I looked at the session timer. The Senhari technical advisor was beginning a 5th presentation of the same projection model, this time with updated acceleration figures that were worse than the previous version. I stood up. There was a brief, surprised silence. Delegates from a dozen species looked at me. The session chair, a Dryathite delegate named Kunvaith, looked at me with large, patient eyes. "The human liaison has not been recognized," Kunvaith said. "I apologize for the interruption," I said. My voice was steadier than I expected it to be. "I would like to propose something that will probably sound wrong before it sounds right, and I ask 30 seconds of patience before anyone dismisses it." Kunvaith looked around the table. No one objected. I think they were simply curious, or tired. "The authorization dispute between the 2 managing species," I said. "It relates to water rights on the Pahlavi system." "That is correct," someone confirmed. "The Pahlavi water rights dispute has been in informal mediation for 3 years without resolution," I said. "But it was resolved, in a different form, once before. 60 years ago, before the current licensing boundaries were drawn, the same 2 species had an identical dispute over mineral extraction on a shared body in that region. The dispute was resolved through a temporary resource-sharing partition that was automatically sunset after the crisis period ended." I looked around the table. "That partition model is in the Council records. If it was used once, it can be proposed as an emergency framework again, with the same automatic sunset clause. It is not a resolution to the Pahlavi dispute. It is a temporary parallel structure that allows the two blocking species to authorize joint action in the Shailen corridor without it constituting a formal concession in the water rights negotiation. Silence. It is not a legal resolution, I said. It is a procedural bypass using a precedent from the Council's own historical record. It lets both species say yes to the corridor intervention without either of them saying yes to anything that affects Pahlavi. The sunset clause means it disappears automatically. There is nothing to negotiate and nothing to lose. The Senhari technical advisor was looking at me with an expression I could not fully read. The Dryathai session chair was still watching me with those patient eyes. Then a delegate from the Kwarathi said, in a careful voice, the partition precedent would need to be formally verified. I have the record reference, I said. I read out the archive number from memory. I had read it 4 months ago and had held onto it in the way that humans hold onto things that feel like they might matter someday. There was a moment. Then 3 people in the room began accessing their archive systems simultaneously. 20 seconds later, one of them confirmed it. The next hour was the fastest I had ever seen the emergency response subconsole move. The partition framework was drafted, reviewed, modified in 2 small places, and formally proposed to the 2 blocking species within 40 minutes. Both species, presented with a procedural path that required no concession in their ongoing dispute, agreed within the hour. Authorization was granted. Evacuation assets were committed. The terraforming intervention team was assembled and dispatched. The transit hub was evacuated with 9 hours to spare. I received no formal acknowledgement in the session record. The action was logged under the Council's standard crisis response protocol, with the partition framework credited to the historical precedent. My name was in the participation log as an observer advisor, nothing more. Director Serrano, when I told her what had happened, sat quietly for a full minute. Then she said, "You stood up without authorization." "Yes," I said. "In a senior subconsole session." "Yes." She was quiet again. Then, "And you had the archive reference memorized." "I read a lot," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I am going to formally reprimand you in the session debrief report. The protocol violation needs to be on record." "I understand," I said. "And then," she continued, "I am going to recommend you for elevation to full liaison status." I looked at her. "That requires 5 years of provisional service. I have been here 8 months. "There is a pathway for exceptional circumstances," she said. "I have never used it before." She stood up. "There will be consequences for today, Kale. Some of them will be good. Some of them will be complicated. All of them will require you to be more careful than you were in that room, because you are now visible in a way that you cannot undo." She moved toward the door, then she stopped. "The Dryathai token," she said, without turning around. "The warning about a second test. The first test was data collection. The Velthari wanted to know how we argued." "And the second test?" I asked. She turned. She looked at me with the same expression she had worn in the chamber the day everything started, the expression that was not quite a smile but was the structural ancestor of one. "The second test," she said, "was to see what we would do when the room was drowning and no one was asking us to save it." She left. I sat alone in the prep room for a moment, the station humming around me, the quiet constant noise of 312 civilizations going about the work of holding the galaxy together. I thought about Gordon Price, a man in New Zealand with a notebook and a love of numbers, working on a problem no one had asked him to solve, in a journal that barely anyone read. Producing something that saved a civilization he never knew existed. I thought about what Director Serrano had said 6 months ago. We scare them. We just do not know it yet. I thought about the 9 hours to spare. The most dangerous thing in any competition is the opponent who is trying to understand you. Understanding leads to control. The Velthari had spent 6 months trying to build a model of us. And the thing about humans, the thing that Gordon Price had demonstrated in a small journal with a readership of 400 people, the thing that Director Serrano had demonstrated in a deliberation chamber before 312 species, the thing that I had apparently just demonstrated in an emergency subconsole session by reading every crisis log ever filed and holding onto a 60-year-old archive number because it felt like it might matter someday, was that we did not know we were doing any of this. We were not strategic in the way the Velthari were strategic. We did not sit down and build 40-year plans and then execute them with careful patience. We read things that interested us. We asked questions that bothered us. We stood up in rooms where we had not been recognized because something felt wrong and we thought we might know how to fix it. We were not predictable because we were not following a plan. We were following something messier and harder to model, curiosity and a deep, apparently inescapable instinct that when something is broken, you should try to fix it, even when no one is watching, even when the fix is uncertain, even when the room is full of beings who have been doing this for 40,000 years and have decided that the situation is simply what it is. I wrote my mission log that evening. At the end, I added a note that was not really part of the official record. They challenged us because they thought we were the smallest thing in the room. What they are slowly discovering is that we have never, in our entire history as a species, let being small stop us from doing anything. They can model our arguments. They can model our research. They can model our crisis responses. What they cannot model is the part of us that does not know when to be sensible. That part, I think, is the part they are actually afraid of. And it is also, I think, the part that is going to matter most. I closed the log. Outside the station's observation port, the stars continued their long, patient work, burning across distances that would have been unimaginable to people a century before me. We had been in space for 40 years. Some of these civilizations had been here for 40,000. But we were still here, still talking, still finding archive numbers in old records and standing up without permission and asking questions that made ancient chambers fall silent. Still surprising everyone, including ourselves. That I thought would have to be enough. And somehow, looking out at all that dark and all that light, I was certain that it was.